Senator Lee yields back, and I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask some questions first about preemption of state and local laws and then about forced arbitration. So if we spend too much time on the first one, I may cut some of you off because I want to get to the second one. For people with disabilities, AVs are a transformational technology that holds the promise of greatly improving independence and mobility, but we can't overcome barriers to independence by preempting state and local accessibility laws and weakening the enforcement of the ADA. The Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities, which includes organizations like the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the American Foundation for the Blind, has submitted a letter for the record expressing concerns that preemption language, and I quote, regarding the design, construction, or performance of AVs could harm efforts to improve access and benefits for disabled and other historically underserved travelers. And I was going to ask, Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. So let me ask some questions. Mr. Riccoboni, would you be concerned about federal legislation preempting state and local laws adopting accessibility requirements for the benefit of people with disabilities?
Well, thank you for the question. What I would say to that is that, the accessibility requirements need to be a standard across the country. This is a problem we see sometimes in other areas where there's variation. So the federal government, I think, plays an important role, and that's where I referenced the United States Access Board is a tremendous resource for NHTSA and others on this issue to set a reasonable and powerful standard to make sure whatever happens in this area, that it is fully inclusive for people with disabilities.
Thank you. Mr. Shapiro, do your members support preempting state and local laws adopting accessibility requirements for the benefit of people with disabilities?
In the sense of building cars, absolutely, because to build a car on a national basis as opposed to do it for local requirements, the economies of scale are such that we'll be charging consumers more because if there are local requirements. And it has been how cars have developed in our regulatory structure is that the safety features of the car are regulated nationally. In terms of driver requirements, things like that, that's a state look, and that's what this legislation envisions.
And then, Mr. Bozzella, same question. Do your members support preempting state and local laws adopting accessibility requirements for the benefit of people with disabilities?
I think accessibility is critically important, and it's one of the opportunities we have in terms of the benefits this technology provides. However, we need to build one fleet for the nation, and so those accessibility requirements should be established in a way that allows us to make sure that they are part of every vehicle, one fleet of vehicles for the nation.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Koopman instead on the forced arbitration. This same letter from the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities encourages us to prohibit forced arbitration clauses in AV legislation to ensure AV providers can be, in quotes, held accountable for injuries and property damage. So, Mr. Koopman, what would be the effect of forced arbitration agreements imposed on AV users on mobility and safety for the disabled community?
I think that a forced arbitration provision would make it much more difficult for the disabled to assert their rights and hold companies accountable. Mr. Riccobono mentioned the problems they have with ride-hailing networks. I remember a time when we were promised that ride-hailing was going to solve all the mobility needs and deliver food to food deserts and help out folks who had mobility problems. I remember that time, and it didn't work out. And my understanding is forced arbitration has played a large role in that outcome.
And then lastly, are there unique safety and operational considerations with respect to AVs and people with disabilities that we should take into account as we consider the AV legislation?
Yes, there are. And the engineering safety standards I mentioned actually speak directly to those. For example, and Mr. Riccobono, again, was talking about how the companies are addressing this, and that's great that some companies are addressing it. That things that if you don't have sight, that signs inside the cars aren't going to work. If you're hearing impaired, audio cues aren't going to work. And so these things definitely have to be taken into account in designing these vehicles.
All right, thanks so much. I really think that the deployment of AVs doesn't have to come at the expense of state and local accessibility laws and the rights of the disabled to seek justice for ADA violations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.